you cannot live without trust. That's not possible. And one of the things that happens for people, even psychologically within a relationship after they experience betrayal, is trust becomes difficult for them to get. But trust is not optional for us. We can't, like, when you start withdrawing trust, you'll just fall down into a bottomless well of cynicism and then nihilism, and then you're in despair. Realize, not just think about or believe about, but they can realize sacredness in their life in a way that is aligned with the acquisition of knowledge and the cultivation of wisdom. I think that is that's the core argument I'm making and what I'm proposing.
I am really excited about this. So
great.
I think so the listeners might not know who you are. So I just thought I would let you introduce yourself, because I'm actually quite a new fan. So I don't know your total background. What I know is you're a university professor, you do cognitive science, and you're working on some really cool projects that seem interesting. So I'll just let you I'll let you go.
Yeah. I'm John Vervaeke. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. As you said, I'm in cognitive science. I'm also in cognitive psychology. I have a double appointment. And I suppose how most people might have heard of me is I did an online lecture series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I have a bunch of other series on the Cognitive Science Show channel. I've done one on the nature of consciousness, the nature of the self, the nature of transformation, and doing one right now on the nature of psychopathology. All of these are done dialogically. I'm doing them with other people: Greg Enriquez, Christopher Master-Pietro, Zach Stein, Gary Hovannisian. And then I also have a Voices with Vervaeke, where I meet with people and do dialogue about a lot of these emerging topics and concerns that people have. I also do academic work. I publish on the nature of intelligence and relevance realization, wisdom, meaning in life, etc.
Yeah, that's awesome. And a lot of our listeners have come from, they grew up maybe in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and now have decided that they don't believe it. They walk away for whatever reason. And so I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your religious background.
Yes. I have perhaps a strong analogy with many of your listeners then. I was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian family, and in late high school, grade 11, grade 12, I guess where this might happen to a lot of people. I read some books. I read a book by Roger Zelazny called Lord of Light, and around the same time I read Robertson Davies' Fifth Business that introduced me to Jung. Lord of Light introduced me to Buddhism and Vedanta and alternative mythologies to the Christian mythos. I read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse that brings all of that stuff sort of together, and it really blew me open in a sort of powerful way. Now there was good to that, because it took me out of that form of Christianity, which upon reflection and some therapy, I realized was quite traumatizing for me. But it also left me hungry and sort of almost psychologically exposed. And so fortunately for me, I went into university and took an introduction to philosophy course, and we did the Republic, and I met the figure of Socrates, which has had a profound impact on me, and the idea of the cultivation of godlikeness through the cultivation of wisdom, Plato's mystical vision of self-transcendence. I felt like it spoke to me, and it sort of articulated the incoherent hunger in me. Now I went on in academic philosophy, but very quickly, at least at that time, the topics of wisdom and self-transcendence and whatnot fall off the table and you get involved in all these very technical questions that are really not of interest to people outside of academic philosophy. Now, I found the skills that I was learning very valuable. I encountered figures who were deeply important to me, like Heidegger and Spinoza. But my hunger for wisdom and self-transcendence was not being addressed. Down the street, there was like a dojo for me, and they were teaching Vipassana meditation, meta contemplation. These are Buddhist practices, and Tai Chi Chuan, which is a Taoist practice, in a manner that I would later come to call an ecology of practice. That's where I got sort of the initial idea from that. And that just and I started practicing all of that very, very deeply and religiously. And that sort of shifted. A lot of people were noting to me that I was changing how I was in the world. That shifted me. And I started reading a Tillich that really introduced me to a new way of thinking about religion and Christianity in particular. I read John Caputo's book on the mystical element in Heidegger's thought, because I was already so interested in Heidegger, and I got introduced to Eckhart and the Christian Neoplatonic tradition. I started reading Hadot and philosophy as a way of life, and got really deeply interested in Stoicism and Neoplatonism, started incorporating those into my daily practices. And that's where I'm at sort of spiritually today.
So how long did that last for you, where you kind of felt like you didn't, I don't know, have a spiritual home, maybe is a way to put it?
Probably from, I don't know, the middle 80s. In fact, I dropped out of university after my MA for a year because I was so disillusioned. But then I found cognitive science and I went back to university. I guess it lasted about 10, 15 years. I mean, I don't want people to think I was constantly in sort of Kierkegaardian angst. I mean, at some point, I felt like I was moving in a direction. I feel like I'm still moving. I don't think I've stopped, nor do I think I want to. But yeah, that lasted for quite a while. But what happened is I began to bring some of these topics like mindfulness and wisdom into my psychology classes. And I noticed that my students were really excited about this. And I was taking cognitive science, and it was shifting into this embodied view of cognition, largely because of the influence of my friend and colleague, Evan Thompson. And so I was starting to bring all of this in, and I noticed my students were really, and so it started more and more to lead me to believe, I hope, I aspire with the appropriate humility, that the issues I was wrestling with were not unique to me. Like when I was in the depths of this, and I got really stuck when I was trying to work on my PhD, I went into therapy, and that also opened me up to the more symbolic side of things. So yeah, I mean, I can't, I'm hesitating because I can't put sort of a definitive boundary on it, because it sort of blurs and bleeds from sort of intense, sometimes very intense kind of darkness to where I'm at today.
Well, and it kind of comes up and down. When you said you felt stuck, that's interesting you use that word, because that's the way I described the last few years while I was practicing in my faith, because I'd have highs, like I'd have moments where I felt like I was supposed to be there. It's usually when you're serving other people, or it was usually moments like that where you just feel like an outside love for people, right? And then I did notice there are times where you just felt alone, because you're like, this doesn't feel right. I can't quite align what I'm really thinking with what I am supposed to think.
Yeah.
So that's and so I guess
I mean, first of all, I just want to acknowledge what I felt in you. Like I know, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but I know what you're putting your finger on, that I used to at times call it even a black burning. It was like there was this something burning because things just didn't fit together right. There was a gap. There was a, yeah.
And you try to make it work. Like you'd
Yeah.
have highs, you'd have moments where you felt like you were okay. And then just other times where you're realizing like, this isn't what like reality isn't what I think it is, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So when you kind of stepped away from your religious practice, were you able to maintain relationships, or were they strained a little bit? How did you navigate that?
Um, it was odd. I remember a beloved cousin of mine. He was, he still is, and he's still within, I guess, what I would call a fundamentalist framework. But I deeply respect him for his intellectual capacities and integrity. But we had gone for a walk, and I was talking to him, and I remembered he was struggling to try and deal with this, and the only way he could do it was, he said, "Well, I think you're a heretic." That was the category he could come up for me, which I thought was somewhat interesting. The rest of my family wasn't so explicit. They kind of did a don't ask, don't tell kind of thing with me. And because I wasn't living near them and I only saw them very infrequently, that sort of became, I mean, they knew I was no longer going to church. I went back like you, and I tried a more liberal version, and increasingly more liberal version of Christianity. And I couldn't, as you did, I couldn't make it work. And so I think they had enough respect for how much they saw me trying, that I think they just sort of retreated into silent hope that I would somehow find my way back. None of them wanted to argue with me. Um, uh,
Yeah,
Perhaps, go ahead.
it becomes like an elephant in the room where no one
Yes.
really wants to address it. And that's kind of
Yeah.
what I'm learning. And I'm trying to decide, and then maybe it's a case by case basis. Maybe it's not a hard, fast rule, but I am trying to figure out, do you talk about the elephant in the room so you can have deeper relationships and just be able to be in the room with difference, or do you just ignore it? And I feel like the relationships that I currently have, where I can actually just say what I'm thinking, and then we can separate and say, well, I disagree, but I still respect you, right? I think you have good
Mm.
qualities, you have good character, you have wisdom. I can see that you're trying your best. Like that is enough to have that commonality to have good relationships. That's But yeah, that you're describing a lot of relations, a lot of the struggle that those that walk away from religion, they find the relationships either superficial, they're not authentic anymore. Because yeah, so that's interesting that you
There is
find
that,
this.
and I mean, it takes a while um, to find a proper venue and home for cultivating fellowship and friendship, as opposed to what we have in general, like co-workers and acquaintances.
Yes.
And when you've been in religio, to bind together, you're connected to people in a deep way, fellowship. And within the sphere of fellowship, you often develop very deep friendships. Friendship is where people are committed to each other's growth in an ongoing manner. Um, and so it takes a while to find a place. And for me, I actually, to be really honest, I never found a place. I had to make it. I had to, like, I became, I don't know, I never intended, nor do I know if I even want this job, but I'm still doing it now. Somebody who helps start and build communities where people can do these kinds of practices and engage in fellowship and uh, spiritual friendship with each other. So yes, I think that sense of homelessness is a real challenge. And I guess I would want to say that there are one, I want to be as careful as possible. I'm trying to encourage and create and co-create places where people who are post religious in the sense we're talking about can refine fellowship and friendship in a way that is philosophically profound and spiritually transformative. That is exactly one of the things I am trying to do and committed to do.
That sounds amazing, because what I've found being in, and I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, because waking up, this is what I feel like I did, and I would hate to be offensive to any of my family who I've 100% respect for trying to stand for what they believe. But I feel like I only found community in people that hated the same thing I hated. And that is just no basis for relationships. The best relationships I found, you might meet them somewhere where you have this common experience, but I found that the relationship has flourished when we start focusing on different things that we have in common instead of this thing that we dislike that we have in common. And it's interesting because often you have like this black and white thinking, and that's how people describe a lot of, I don't know how to describe it, just like that dogmatic black and white, true or false, there's no in the middle. And I feel like it's a process to get rid of that. And I see it popping up in ex-Mormon spaces where there's still that black and white thinking. I had an interview, my last interview, my guest brought up the fact that maybe you have to not be able to see the good for a while to be able to step away from it. And then you can kind of start to see the good again and not be so, I don't know, cynical, I guess. So
I totally agree with that. I went through a period where I described myself as sort of a very trenchant atheist. I don't describe myself that now. That way I consider myself a non-theist. But through Tillich and eventually through Christian Neoplatonism, I've come to appreciation in the multiple senses of that word, of Christianity that in some ways I never had within it. And because of that, I've entered into deep and loving dialogos with several Christians. And we consistently find it mutually beneficial to do so. So I think that's very good advice that your friend gave you. I think stepping away from the propositional and focusing on the ability to share practices, I think that is also advice I would give to, you're not, if you're interacting with the nuns, the NONES that are seeking, you're not going to, if you try, what we'll do is we'll cobble together a unified, integrated metaphysics that we all commit to and sets of propositions. That's not going to happen. People are going to have overlapping families, right, of propositions. But if you come together, if you realize the kind of fellowship that's available around shared ecologies of practices, and a shared philosophical endeavor to talk deeply to each other about our ontological and metaphysical commitments, I think if you reframe that way, I think you're much more likely to make the kinds of connections that you're seeking and that afford further progress in the cultivation of wisdom.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a couple of aha moments, and in the last 6 months or so, one of them was stop worrying about what I used to believe and start developing what I do believe. And that was a pretty big moment for me. And then I did this, it was actually, it's like a weight loss thing, but it's more development, like try to become the person that doesn't weigh as much, not like try to avoid the yo-yo dieting stuff, right?
Yeah.
And this gal has set up this program, and it's really amazing. It's a lot of, I think, cognitive behavioral science type stuff that she's integrated into it. And it's really amazing. And she had this coaching call where she mentioned that you really do have to believe you are where you're supposed to be. And I couldn't tell myself that. I had kind of this atheistic mindset where I couldn't believe something like that without evidence or something. Like
Sure.
I, but I allowed myself to step into that, and it was a little bit life-changing. Like I decided, even though I can say I don't know when I don't know, I can still feel that feeling of feeling where you are where you're supposed to be. That is a real feeling, and it helps you navigate life, I think. So anyway, and it's interesting that came through a weight loss program.
Well, I mean, the way you're describing it, that sort of makes sense to me. The way you framed it, it's an aspirational project, and it sounds like it's trying to promote a kind of deeper transformation. And that, I think, that makes sense to me then, because typically that's what the aspiration to transform into someone who is capable of reconnecting in a deep way, I think is an essential part of this journey that we're both on. I mean, what was helpful to me, and I don't know if this is helpful. I mean, I've done a lot of work on, the cognitive science of meaning and the experience of sacredness and self-transcendence. And what I'm trying to offer to people is an understanding of those that doesn't explain them away, but explains their deep functionality, why they matter so much, in a way that also helps to, vet people's choices for certain practices that they want to take up. I mean, that's what I mean by I'm trying to bridge between science and spirituality, so that people can, I want to be careful, people can realize, not just think about or believe about, but they can realize sacredness in their life in a way that is aligned with the acquisition of knowledge and the cultivation of wisdom. I think that is that's the core argument I'm making and what I'm proposing.
Yeah. When you talk about the meaning crisis, when did you recognize it? Where did you, so you say you kind of began your meaning journey, I guess, kind of, and it was great. It was gradual. You don't really have a moment where you, I guess, do you ever still struggle with the feeling of meaningless? Like, does that ever bother you anymore?
Only in the sense that it's been woven into an ongoing realization of the inexhaustibleness of reality, and that I can't, well, I have to give up something that I was taught. I have to give up seeking a kind of cognitive closure, a kind of final resting place in which the dance of dialogos will draw to a close. But I don't have moments of despair. I have faced, I mean, about 7 years ago, my marriage ended, and I did face very deep grief, and trying to realize how to be responsible and in right relationship to grief is something that I think I've made some progress on. At least people around me say that's the case, people who know me well. And I try to share that with people. And I think it's important when people are going through the process that we're talking about here, that they don't confuse despair and grief. You shouldn't try to cure grief. I mean, you were close to something or someone, I don't know how, I don't want to impose on you. And whether or not that was fictional or not, that doesn't matter. That your brain had deep attachment, and you're going through a grieving process and trying to get the discernment to separate. I don't want to separate despair, which is sort of an appropriate hunger. You want to alleviate despair. You want to find something that satisfies that hunger in a way that's intellectually and aesthetically and morally responsible. But you shouldn't be trying to satisfy your grief. I try to use this analogy with people. People experience grief like a hole, right? And they think that what they're trying to do is heal and close the hole. So I don't feel the hole anymore. No, no. What you do is you grow around the hole so it ceases to take up so much of your psyche. And so it actually becomes an aperture through which you can look at things that you couldn't see before. And that, I think, is like really important, like for people to take be very careful on getting the kind of Socratic self-knowledge to really discern and pull apart well, there's actually three things: despair and anger and grief. And you got to get them clearly pulled apart, and they have to be addressed in different ways. At least that's what I would propose.
Interesting. Yeah, and I'd add in time. I think time has helped a lot. Just
time helps. Time helps because if you don't get stuck. The thing with grief, the problem that people have with grief is they can get stuck in it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Time helps if time is aligned to an aspirational project of becoming the kind of person that can bear the grief and actually look through it rather than be always looking at it and blinded by it.
Oh, I like that a lot, because there was a time there where I was, it seemed, and this is a pretty universal experience. If I'm talking to my audience, they're going to maybe have gone through it, where you wouldn't allow yourself to look at certain information, and then all of a sudden you allow yourself, and it becomes this rabbit hole, and you can't get enough of it. It's starting to affect your life too, because you're staying up way late reading, and then you're consuming all of these podcasts and all of this information, and it's just coming in. And then I remember I was in there, and I kind of, it was almost like I looked up and I was like, oh, my life is still going on. I still have to take care of my kids. I still have to get some sleep. I still have to take care of myself. And it was when I like started focusing on my life, that was so much more healing than, I don't know, going down the rabbit hole. I don't know how to, but it was like this hunger that I did have to satisfy. And once it was satisfied, it was like, now my interest really isn't there anymore. Like I'll see things pop up where someone found this about the history or something like that. And I'm just like, huh, okay. Like, I don't care anymore. It's not my interest. My interest is somewhere else now, which it feels much better. Like, I don't know how to.
No, I think that's well said. I think that that's well said. I think that it's very much like you have to properly grieve a relationship so that you're capable of loving in someone else again, and it's something similar to my mind to this. Like there's first the despair of, oh no, I'll never be loved again, right? And then you'll do things about that, and you'll fantasize, and you're bound up with and then the shocking part goes away if you keep moving, and then you hit grief, and then you go through grief, and to the degree to which we are successful in it and existentially responsible to it, it enables a kind of deeper sensitivity and responsiveness, so that we can love again in a way that is meaningful. And so I think people do something deeply analogous that with God, if I had to put a name on it. I think your advice is well said. It has its own tempo, and you can't force it. You have to. That's why Taoism has been very helpful to me for this process. You're not just simply sitting there passively, but you can't make it happen. You have to participate in it. You have to get into it and flow with it and follow its rhythms and listen to its melody, right? And you have to do like the way you play music, right? And you have to play along in the good senses of the word. That's been both something I've experienced from the first person and something that has come to me from sort of researching all of this.
Yeah, and that's when I feel the best, is when I'm participating in life. That's kind of when I was only on the end of researching and taking in information, it was not satisfying. I like the relationship analogy. The analogy I tell people is like, I feel like I was cheated on because you put a lot of trust in the
Yeah.
organization. You're kind of brought up to believe that they have the objective truth, or at least the closest thing to it. You know that they're imperfect men leading the church, but you have this belief that they are the closest thing to it, at least, because
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is the special. We have a living prophet. That's how we were brought up to believe. And so when you kind of come out of this and you realize that they are people just like me with just a man-made thing placed on top of them, and they didn't tell you information that's very relevant to the
Yeah.
way you were believing, you feel cheated on. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and I
Yes.
imagine Jordan Peterson, I read his Maps of Meaning book, and I think he had an analogy in there about how when you find out you've been cheated on, your reality, like the reality you
Yes.
thought you were living in is not the reality you are in. And anyway, reading through a lot of stuff, I've mapped on my experience onto stories and stuff like that, and it's helped me kind of sort through everything. But yes, I think the relationship analogy is very powerful there.
Yeah. And I think the sense of betrayal is real. And again, that maybe allows me to put a finer point on what I'm talking about. You cannot live without trust. That's not possible. And one of the things that happens for people, even psychologically within a relationship after they experience betrayal, is trust becomes difficult for them to get. But trust is not optional for us. We can't, like, when you start withdrawing trust, you'll just fall down into a bottomless well of cynicism and then nihilism, and then you're in
Yes.
despair, right? And so, like, undertaking the practices that really enable you to wisely trust again, I think, is a big part of this journey.
That's a good segue. I would also say that it's hard to trust yourself again because
Yes.
you use so much self-deception to avoid, I call them snakes. Like some information will pop up here, it'll pop up there, and you go, that doesn't really matter. Yeah, I think I will. I'm gonna skip ahead here. So you mentioned in one of your lectures a hypothetical of having your parents work for the government and you're a
Yeah.
research.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
in that little segment, so I'll paraphrase here for our audience. You just turn 18, your parents pull you into a secret room in your house and they tell you they're not really your parents. They don't really love you. They are just following a script and doing their job. Because you're 18, they are obligated to tell you, but they're willing to just walk out of the room like it never happened, and they will go back to living the way they lived. And you mentioned that we want to know reality. We wouldn't do it. And
Yeah.
I was talking to my husband about this, and he was like, you should ask him if that's not really the case, because I feel like what I did, there were chances where I saw the snake and I ignored it. And I decided
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
a joke. My parents are just joking. So I am going to continue living this lie because I think it's just a joke. And the reality I'd rather have is loving parents. And so I'm going to go on pretending I have loving parents. And the fact that it's loving parents is no coincidence, because we use that phrase when I was active, you use that phrase that you have loving Heavenly Father, and actually loving parents. They have the theology that we believe in a Heavenly Mother too. We just don't talk about her a lot. And so we believe we have these loving parents.
Yes.
And so, and that gives you meaning and purpose because he loves you and he wants you to do the things anyways. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, just a little bit. I did say in the setup, they give you sort of incontrovertible evidence.
Oh, okay.
Right. But
And maybe that's when the actual collapse of belief happens, because I did feel that. And where I am now, I don't feel like I can go back. But there was
no,
moments where maybe there was little peeks into what I thought was not fitting right. Either you're in school and you're learning something, you're like, wait a minute, or whatever it is.
let me respond to the intent, because
Okay.
I let's say that it's not something like that's that definitive, perhaps. But so we should question people before the event and see if they would even go to the event. So I also regularly do this. I will poll my students in my classes, and here we're falling back on the relationship analogy again. And I'll say, how many of you are in like really satisfying romantic relationships? And they'll put up their hands. And I say, okay, now I'm just addressing these people. And it's usually a large number, by the way. And then I'll say, keep up your hand if you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you, even though that would destroy the relationship. And 95% of them keep up their hand. There is the 5% that take their hands down.
Okay.
Right. So what I'm saying is I acknowledge that. And this isn't like a bona fide scientific experiment or anything, but still it's pretty reliable result across multiple classes. Right. And these are people that are supposed to be the most invested in romantic relationships of where they are in their life. So it's not completely useless evidence either. Right. And so it's like, yeah, there's something. And, Robert Nozick has an argument of this, and Plato makes the argument. When you start to suspect that something isn't real, like that triggers a definite meta desire in us, which is, in addition to whatever fulfills our desires and gives us meaning, we want it to be real. We really want it to be real. Now, but that isn't all usually like, oh, the curtains part and you see the man behind the curtain and the Wizard of Oz is just a fraud. That's usually not what happens. So a way of thinking about it is, you've been looking at an object in a distance and you're pretty convinced that's a human being, and you've been looking, but as you move, you start to get little things around, right? But then right? And then all of a sudden there's a shift, and it gestalts, it changes, and you go, oh, that's a scarecrow. All this time I've been thinking it's and you don't really do that. You can't sort of like, right, like ahead of time. But notice once it does that self-organization, you can't go back. You can't go, well, I'm going to go back to seeing it as a human. And you can try for quite a while. You can even pretend, but there's a part of you that won't let go, because you are trying to be in contact with reality in a fundamental way. So that's a long answer to your husband, but what I would say is, I think there's a minority of people who would try. I think you can, and when we're in a gray zone, I think you can ignore the potential to regestalt sort of around the edges. But as soon as it starts to take on a life of its own and starts, and once it regestalts, you can't go back. You can't go back.
Right. And one of the things that's been really healing for me is to interact with faithful members that are still members of the church. And there's the thing I'm realizing more and more, people with good character, there's really no divide that separates them, like a true divide. So I've realized that there are people that have healthier relationships within religion than I did, I guess.
Yes, I've realized that too.
And they seem to be doing the same game I'm doing, looking through this lens, and it helps them. And I really don't have any judgment on that. Like I want to support them where they need to be. So I don't really feel like people need to do my path, because I don't know their nature and nurture. Maybe their nature and nurture, that's the best place for them. It's kind of like climbing to the top of the mountain, and there are more than one path, I guess. I'm universalist in my in my meaning domain. So go ahead.
Well, I'd like to speak to that, because I think that's very much the case. I explicitly and repeatedly say, if people come engage with my work and that allows them to, in intellectual honesty, return to the depths of their faith, and that does happen, great. Right? I like, great. I want to alleviate the meaning crisis. I'm not here to set up, a block of agreement. But that's not what this is about. This is about really trying to improve people's lives. I do think it's also like I say, I have deep and profound conversations with committed Christians, with committed Muslims, with committed Jews, and we often the bonds that are formed there, cultivated there, are both parties admit these are deep and transformative. Because, and here's the more controversial thing I'm now going to say, I think in the end, we pretend we're in religion. And this is because of things like the Protestant Reformation and a bunch of things. We think of this as how it's always been. Notice how we equate faith with belief as if they're synonyms. And so we pretend that we're engaged in some kind of knowledge about some specific special kinds of entities. When I think that what's really driving religious behavior, when it is healthy and functional, the way we're talking about here, is the cultivation of wisdom as opposed to knowledge. And wise people recognize each other. Oh, sorry, that's too pretentious. Sorry. Lovers of wisdom, the original meaning of the word philosopher, right? Lovers of wisdom recognize and resonate with each other across these divides in a way that often, right, undermines the idea, but we have to believe X. Because what you find, we research on this, if you're in a religious tradition, your ability to cultivate wisdom is better than if you're secular. But it doesn't matter which religious tradition you're in, right? So when you say the first part, religious people usually go, yay, and then I say the second part and they go, oh, right? And it's like, yeah, because what seems to be, I don't want to be insulting here. So I'm trying to be very careful. But I would propose that what is really efficacious in people's religious lives is the cultivation of wisdom, the reduction of foolishness, the enhancement of connectedness to themselves, to other people, to the world. And I think people of good faith and genuine philosophia, the fellowship love of wisdom, can connect across these doctrinal divides and resonate with each other in mutually beneficial and powerful ways. That I'm more than persuaded of that. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah. Okay, so with a little bit of time, so I talked to a friend that I was interviewing you, and I had a couple that were like, no way, because they're really big fans. And I did want to ask this question because I'm going to ask it for him. He said, like, he watched your meetings, he watched the whole thing. So I'm only on like episode 7 or something like that. And he's watched your whole thing. He's an active member. And he's like, all of these, so I feel like the church is the solution to all of the problems of the meaning crisis. And so how did I word this question? I want to ask, is it possible that this meaning crisis could be solved by some kind of restored church? That's what the claim is in the LDS faith. Like, is it, could there be a new, restored, revealed faith system by God, say the LDS faith? Like, could that be possible? Is that all in your mind possible, I guess? Asking for a friend.
Well, I hope you're interested in the question as well.
Yes. Well, it does make me wonder, because, you said that scarecrow analogy, and it makes me wonder, well, could the person be dressed up as a scarecrow, right?
Yes.
So and there's always like that deeper maybe, right? Or that the revealed things that are being revealed have more to do with reality than just like a man-made construct of some sort, right? Like where is that metaphysical truth? If that makes, I don't know. So yeah.
No, I think that's good. And I mean, have we, by the way, if you want to talk again, I'm happy to do so. If there's more questions you'd like to address, I sense a bit of a kindred spirit and authenticity in you, and so I'm responding to that if
I love
you would
that.
like that. Okay. So I don't have a foreclosure argument on religion. I can't say, and here is the argument that shows it can't transform its way in the way that's needed. And do I see in these conversations genuine and deep reformation and transformation going on within people that are within a committed religious home, nevertheless trying to seriously and deeply respond to the meaning crisis? I do see that. I do see that. I also know, and I don't think any of these people would disagree with me, that there's an entrenchment of a questionable framing of reality around certain propositions. There are ways in which the institutional history of these have hurt and harmed people, traumatized them, that needs to be properly met and addressed. And I do think that these, yes, I want to say this. I do not think a religion can do this unless it enters into a deep reciprocal reconstruction with the best cognitive science of the day and the best living philosophy. I don't mean academic philosophy, but the cultivation of wisdom, the real deep cultivation of wisdom for that, and trying to find the best sort of intellectual framework for doing that. I do see people in all of the faiths doing exactly what I'm saying, and maybe that will work, especially if they also find ways of reaching out to heal those that have been harmed and traumatized. Now, if you ask me about probabilities, I don't think it's probable. I said I think it's very possible, but I don't think it's probable because I think that the way in which the religions have bound themselves to a certain historical program will make it challenging and difficult. But like I said, that's sort of the best estimation on my part. I don't have a clear, definitive answer to this. I can say definitively that this is definitely the case for people within, like individuals and small groups within religions. I see it, I do. But I also think it's definitely possible outside of the established religions in a growing way amongst the nuns. And I see that even more so.
So this appeal to authority would probably not resonate so much.
The appeal to authority, and also the way in which, I mean, especially Christians in the Protestant traditions, right? They've lost connection to the wisdom tradition of the West. For example, people forget that the West does not stand just on the pillar of the Bible. The West stands on another pillar, maybe a pillow too, another pillar, which is the whole Platonic tradition. And the fact that Neoplatonism was able to do this not only for Christianity, but for Islam and Sufism, for Judaism and Kabbalah, and all along the Silk Road, even interactions with Buddhism and Vedanta, that says something that needs to be acknowledged. And the degree to which the existing, I don't know what to call them, Western religions or Abrahamic religions or whatever, I don't know, but the degree to which they can't recover their connections to that wisdom tradition is the degree to which they will not be able to address the people who are secularized and who are committed, I think justifiably so, to the power of the scientific and technological worldview.
Right. That it is related to something else I wanted to ask. I was listening to Jonathan Peugeot, and I'm going to read something he said in a video. It was on his video. He published it in 2020, and it's on the meaning of Christ's death. he was talking about Fraser, and I'm not sure who Fraser is, but he said Fraser, for example, who used all the ancient myths, you know, the so-called dying God to trivialize Christianity. Okay, so I remember now. He was talking about how you have these thinkers that will just tie Christ into another like story of the hero, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
try to say it's not special. And they don't realize they're looking through the lens of Christ. And the event of Christianity was so ground shaking that so many of those that opposed it even today can't help but to do the looking through the glass of Christianity. So, and I hear this a lot, and I've heard Jordan Peterson even say or allude to it, that we are like if we don't maintain this foundation that we're on, this Christian foundation that we are on, we might lose what we have. But I see you're saying the foundation isn't just Christianity. I mean, it's certainly a
No.
part of it, but it's not just Christianity. And certainly our
Yeah.
foundation should be based on reality, not. So anyway, it's just interesting that you brought that up, because that was one of the things I wanted to talk about is like, is the story of Christ, is it more significant than the central in our Western culture? Is it more significant than the other central stories by other religions? Or is it like, is
Well,
there a,
no, no,
do
no.
you
Let's
know what
talk
I'm
about
saying?
this.
Yeah.
I've really wanted to talk about this, and I've never actually had a public forum to do it. So can we talk about this for a bit? Because I
Yeah.
think this is really important, right? For example, and you know, and I have good relationships with both Jonathan and with Jordan. I have deep criticisms of them too, but you know, Jordan is a Jungian, and I mean, what Jung is talking about, of course, is controversial. But Jung's notion of the archetype, like, and the idea, you know, Fraser was an anthropologist, right, or sort of an anthropologist. He wrote the Golden Bough, and he was trying to make that clear, you know, that this motif of the dying and resurrecting God is an archetype. You see it cross-culturally, cross-historically, and Jungians would they're supposed to agree with that proposal. That's kind of how, like, if you want to get into the Jungian events, your card, your members card says believes in archetypes, right? That's got to be, that's on the card, right? And so, and that's a tension. And so many people say Jordan Peterson in Christianity and look, and it's like, well, be careful, because Jung is not a Christian. Jung's a non-theist. Jung thinks that this archetype is, you know, part of the unconscious, the individual, especially the collective unconscious, and therefore there's no one version of it that should be considered primary, because all of the versions, and this is a Platonic notion, by the way, Jung is a Platonist of the psyche. All of these versions are just images of the archetype that itself is never perfectly or finally captured in any image. And then Jonathan's responding to that. And then what he's trying to say is, oh, but it's because we see this through Christian eyes. But what I would say to Jonathan, and he would argue with me, is, yeah, but what gives you your way of making this sort of specific is you've stepped out of the psychological archetypal nature of Christ's incarnation, and you're giving it this Neoplatonic reading, because Neoplatonism is huge influence, and a living influence within Orthodox Christianity, the kind
Right.
that Jonathan and again, right? And so that is what you're sort of pointing to in order to try and make this story special. You're saying, wow, but there's this Neoplatonic account that takes the specificity of the idea of the incarnation of the Logos and gives it a Neoplatonic reading that makes it really profound. I don't deny that that historically happened, or that it is also currently relevant. I think both of those are true. But notice what that does. It's that. Because other than that, you get this weird thing, because Jordan Peterson will say things like that. He'll say, but the Christ story is the best one. And I'm trying to get at, like, what do you mean by that, right? Because what he's trying to say is, I think he's trying to say something like, it's the best story, and therefore that is why you should believe it, a kind of pragmatism. But I want to say, but what makes it the best story? You can't say because it's true, because then you're just arguing in a circle. What makes, and then he seems to say, well, because it recognizes suffering better. And I'm saying, but why, what makes that the absolute criterion for being the best story? The Buddha's story is better at telling me about mindfulness, right? The Taoist story is better at telling me about flow. I don't go to the Christians to learn about how to get into the flow state, right? The Neoplatonic story is a better story for telling me about intelligibility and how he makes, like, why, like, what's the independent argument for, and suffering is the thing that most deeply discloses reality. And I don't think there is any such argument. Is suffering one of the ways? We talked about it earlier, grief, through which people get deep disclosure? Yes. But are mindfulness practices another way in which people get deep disclosure? Yes. Are flow practices? Yes. Are practices working with the intelligibility? Yes. Yes. And that's why I can't, I think if you try to unpack what's going behind those arguments, it actually leads you back to, I can't privilege this story in any way that I can justify, other than, for me, suffering is what is prominent in my life, and I need Christianity to address it. But, if you bring that before a Buddhist, they might say, but where's the mindfulness? Mindfulness,
Where's the
it's so
paying
deep.
attention?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I like that a lot, because there are things missing, at least in my religious upbringing. The paying attention thing that Jordan
Yeah,
Peterson just harps on all the time, I love it. And it helps you have that participating knowing, right?
yeah,
Like if you're
yeah.
paying attention, then you can know where you're supposed to go next.
Yes,
And I guess you do that while you're praying, and when you're doing the right kind of prayers, where you're actually paying attention to your prayer and not just going through the motions and saying blah 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 blah, right? Like you're praying to figure out, what do I need to do today, and you're just really contemplating. Yeah, those prayers went better.
can I
Oh
can I
man,
respond to that?
yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
See, this is what I mean about, and this is something I discovered, because I was also in the sort of Protestant legacy, right? There is a deep and powerful mindfulness meditation tradition within Christianity. It's vibrantly alive, and I think it is as profound and as deep as anything you'll find in Buddhism and Taoism. I'll say that without hesitation. Um, so the people in Christianity that have kept the Neoplatonic tradition alive have kept practices of mindfulness and the cultivation of wise attention going in a way that is distinct from petitionary prayer, where you're asking for some, like they'll right. And so, again, right, the degree to which Christianity has lost the connection to that tradition is the degree to which it can't, this isn't quite the right verb, Marlene, but I don't know, it can't compete, but it's not the quite right verb, but it can't, right, with those wisdom traditions that offer that. Because if you're not training people's attention, you're not training the primary way in which they are connected to reality and to the world.
Yeah. A lot of those traditions, they work backwards too. You know something, and then you interpret that into everything you do, instead of trying to discover what to know,
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
that's the other block that I was running into when I was practicing. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And it's interesting. You are on that 4 Horsemen of Meaning podcast,
Yep.
and you mentioned that you were traumatized by Christianity. And I said, this guy is someone I want to talk to, because he is acknowledging something that I haven't ever heard Jordan Peterson acknowledge. And maybe it's because he doesn't have the religious background.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not talked about a lot in this space where, okay, we're not going to go down the new atheist path,
Mm-hmm.
but there is something they're addressing that this mind space is not addressing. And there is, a grieving process you have to go through, and then just figuring out how to navigate relationships with the community you're still in. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I live in Utah, so a lot of my community believes this
Of
is
course.
I don't want to be hateful toward it or angry
No,
toward it anymore. And I did go through that. I went through that anger phase, and it still pops up every once in a while when
of
something
course.
happens in the news or something, but I don't want that to be my thing I live by. So,
You- I really, yeah, if it means
so
anything to you, and I'm not setting myself up as an authority, but just because we're in genuine, authentic dialogue, yeah, I encourage you in that. Like what you just said, I think, yes, that stay true to that. I really believe that will give you good guidance.
I hope other people are in the same experience as me can find healing wherever that is. And I'm not going to judge that if they feel like they need to deconstruct Mormonism more and then help others do that through podcasts, and that's where they're finding their flow, then I can't judge that. But this is where I found there's got to be other people like me that are just not getting it from that kind of content. So I want to
There are a
create
lot.
content that will help point people to what they do believe, whatever that is. And yeah, anyways, so yeah, I appreciate it. And
Yeah,
yeah, I
there are
would
a
love to
lot.
talk again.
There are a
So
lot of those people. There are a lot of those people. So keep doing what you're doing. I mean, we share the same goal. There's a lot of those people, and all of my work is directed towards giving them a philosophically, intellectually respectable, spiritually transformative response that is neither, you know, I must return, or I'm just going to be angry at it for the rest of my, but other than those two alternatives, just that place that you're in. Yes, um, I think there's a lot of people, and I think you're doing good work by trying to reach out and help them.
yeah, well, thank you. And hopefully we can talk again. I'm going to
Yes,
stop
I
the
would like
recording.
that very much.